Welcome on this training on the process on how to implement climate change adaptation in NRA processes. This training is part of the ICARUS project. My name is Margreet van Marlen. I'm affiliated with ICARUS. The broader and main ICARUS objective is to improve the uptake of climate change adaptation in the decision-making process of road authorities. This training covers the whole ICARUS framework, starting from the framing, where we now until monitoring and evaluation. The key learning points of today is firstly to understand how to implement climate change adaptation within NRAs. Secondly, to understand the approaches of building the case for adaptation. Thirdly, to understand relationships between the decision context of an NRA, the resilience assessment, and how to implement the results of these in projects or via guidelines. And ultimately, to understand the main hurdles and how to overcome these. When building the case for adaptation, three approaches have been identified. When the decision context is known by the NRA and the steering mechanism and performance metrics, it's possible to building the case for adaptation via the monitoring trends and KPIs. But also it's possible to change guidelines and this way maintaining performance or optimizing performance. And ultimately, more project-specific ways exist, for example, to implement climate change adaptation. Within ICARUS, we have developed this adaptation implementation process. What you can see in this process is that there are three levels of the organization of the NRA involved. On the top left, there's the strategic and tactical level, in the middle, the tactical and operational level, and on the right, the operational. When simplifying the adaptation implementation process, you can see that there are 6 main steps, starting from awareness towards decision context, followed by resilience assessment, adaptation planning and implementation in either asset management or implementation in project. What you can also see is that all managements are and should be involved. There are continuous shifts going from the left at strategic level towards the right, the operational level and back. That's why we also recommend to have one person in charge to streamline this process and guide this process. Secondly, the link with the decision context is key. It's important to understand what the KPIs are and how climate events are linked to the KPIs. Because of that, you know how to perform the resilience assessment, but also how adaptation assessment should be tailored towards meeting the requirements as defined within the KPIs. Ultimately, it's also important to understand how climate change affects the performance of the road network. Implementation in this implementation process is ensured via 2 routes. First is the adaptation at asset management level, and secondly, adaptation at individual project level. When starting with the implementation process, it all starts with awareness. It's important to have all levels of the NRA involved. And all levels should have the same understanding that due to climate change, the road network is facing more disruptions and climate change adaptation is necessary. Before proceeding to understanding the decision context within the NRA, it's important to have resources for the resilience assessment available. If those are not available, maybe it's an option to connect to the long-term planning at an NRA, where there might be the goals to include climate change adaptation in the processes. When getting to the decision context, it's crucial to understand which criteria are used for decision making. So what are the KPIs to be used? I also referred to another presentation and training within the ICARUS project regarding the decision context. If the KPIs are known, it's important to understand how climate events are affected, how climate events affect these KPIs. And to understand what the climate effects are on the performance of the road network for the NRA, climate events should be covered and in there. If they're not in there, you go down and you end up method 1, so to say, where you find correlations between climate events and KPI performance. This can be done, for example, by performing historic events and analysis on what's in performance by the road and when did these events happen. Then you need an extra check whether the KPIs actually are included, whether climate events are included in the KPIs. And if that then is the case, you can check what are the acceptable thresholds. So when do we expect resilience to be acceptable? At the same time, you go to the resilience assessment, but to be able to perform the resilience assessment in the right way, you need to translate the key performance indicators, for example, the availability of the road, towards something that can be measured in the resilience assessment. So it's important that these metrics are the same, otherwise you don't know whether you meet your thresholds, yes or no. If you've done that, you need to check for data availability, and then you can conduct a climate resilience assessment. For that, you do need information also from the operational level, so expert input is necessary at different stages of the implementation. When the outcomes of the resilience assessment are there, you can check with the thresholds based on the decision context whether resilience is acceptable or not. If the resilience is acceptable, you're done. The roads are resilient enough and you can continue with your other work. But if not, then there's another option, that is to accept maybe not to meeting the requirements. But if you don't accept meeting the requirements, you can continue towards adaptation planning. First check there again is whether there are enough resources available to develop an adaptation strategy. In case the resources are available, identify the adaptation options and appraise the co-benefits. It's the same metrics as is used during the resilience assessment. For those, you also need expert input on, for example, the effectiveness of the measures and also what type of measures are potentially effective enough for a specific situation. And based on that, you can see whether there's a positive case for adaptation. Whether there's a positive case for adaptation is also depending on the thresholds that were given in a decision context. If there's no positive case for adaptation, you could reconsider the thresholds. Maybe they were set too high and you want to achieve a too high service level, which costs too much. So maybe you can also have an acceptable level with a lower service level. Also, you could reconsider the decision context, whether the right indicators are used in the key performance indicators and whether the performance levels are achieved. If there is a positive case for adaptation, you then continue to implementation and asset management. Or you can continue to implementation in projects. Either one of them is an option, but they need both. So if you follow the line towards the asset management, you first need to know what are the relevant guidelines that are applicable for your adaptation options. You need to ensure resources to alter these adaptation guidelines. And you need to adapt these adaptation planning, design, construction, operation or maintenance guidelines. However, at the same time, to know what exactly is needed to change in the guidelines, you also need specific projects to experiment and to know what would work and not. So there's a double arrow towards the direction to the right as well, where there could be maybe an optimized adaptation for a specific project, for a specific location. Based on this knowledge, the guidelines can be altered in the most effective way. Ultimately, procurement needs to be adapted and staffing at the NRA is necessary. When that's done, implementation is also needed at the operational level with the relevant stakeholders and to ensure a resilient integration of climate change adaptation in processes. So the summary of today is that firstly, the recommended order for implementing climate change adaptation is awareness, followed by decision context, the resilience assessment, adaptation plan, and ultimately implementation. It is important to understand how climate events impact KPIs and what are the acceptable levels of thresholds. If that's not known, you still need to define those based on, for example, historic events. The outcomes of the resilience assessment should be comparable to the units used within the KPIs and key performance indicators. Otherwise, you're not able to assess whether your resilience assessment meets the set thresholds or not. Throughout implementation, all management levels should be engaged. Otherwise, implementation will become very hard. And ultimately, make sure that resources and budget, expertise and capacity is guaranteed at the different levels of the NRA. But also data availability is of course crucial. This is the end of the presentation on the ICARUS climate adaptation implementation process. If you have any more questions or would like to have more information, I would like to refer you to our website. Also, within this website, there are case studies demonstrated to give you example on climate change adaptation in road processes.